it's been a crazy year for journalism in America. Started with a campaign where then candidate Trump herded journalists into pens and encouraged the audience to yell at them and to do worse than just scream. And it ended with his election, and then this continuing to campaign rhetorically against the press. It has been disorienting, I think, for a lot of newsrooms, how to cover a man whose relationship with facts isn't reliable even for a politician, how to respond to these threats. I think at the same time, I believe, certainly at our school and in the newsrooms that we talk to, his attacks on the press have actually strengthened the press. It's had a clarifying effect on what journalists are supposed to do in a constitutional democracy, which is to hold power to account and to make government decision-making transparent to the public. Marty Barron, the editor of the Washington Post, likes to say, in response to questions about how to handle these attacks, we're not at war, we're at work. You know, we are enshrined in the First Amendment. And I think in a way, in an odd way, not that I would have wished for these events, but journalism in the United States, and I think probably in many places, had been in a state of some confusion, I think, particularly in the years before this election. The digital disruption was one factor, the struggles of newspapers economically was another factor. And I think a generation was coming of age, and we would meet them at our school. They weren't quite sure what journalism was or what exactly its role was. And that's no longer the case. Everyone understands quite clearly what a journalist is and does, and he has increased interest in journalism as a field. So subscriptions at the big news organizations are up dramatically. Applications to our school are up. And this year, I'll finish in a second, but this year we're teaching a new class, the first to come in since the inauguration. And all of my colleagues, I think, say the same thing. In the classroom, there's a new seriousness. You know, a few years ago, it was not unusual to meet a young student and someone would ask them, why did you come to journalism school? And they would say something like, because I wanted to tell my story. And I would think quietly to myself, well, unless you swam here from Guyana, I'm not really interested in your story. So, and that sense of what is the purpose, that's now, we know what journalism is required to do.
Trump é uma figura da normalidade democrática ou Trump é alguém que precisa ser deposto do poder ou a democracia estará constantemente ameaçada?
Well, I think his election followed a wave of illiberal populist political movements around the world. He didn't invent this style of intolerant populism globally, and he didn't invent it even in American history. The kinds of fears and appeals to nativism, immigration restrictions, explicit appeals to white nostalgia, white fears of losing power, that kind of politics has been part of American politics for a very long time. And in the 20th century, candidates like George Wallace in 1968 ran almost exactly the same campaign. It's eerie. A lot of his language, Trump's language, is drawn directly from George Wallace. The difference is that he was able to carry out a hostile takeover of the Republican Party that did not want him as its nominee. The party he took over has moved significantly to the right from where it was 30 or 40 years ago. And the party felt, once he succeeded with his populist takeover, that it had no choice. It was in its interest long-term to follow his lead. Now, you can see that there's a lot of pressure on the Republican Party because they never wanted him to be president in the first place. He's not aligned with their policy agenda in important ways. And they also have the intuitive sense that he's an unpopular president already, and he's going to take the party down with him if this continues. And yet, you see a party that is unwilling to, at this stage, make the difficult choices that would be required to try to initiate, for example, impeachment proceedings against him, where you have this FBI investigation looking into questions about the 2016 campaign that will run its course. I don't know what to expect from those findings. There are certainly people around the president who I think look to be facing some legal difficulties, but whether it would ever reach a point where the Republican Party would choose to initiate constitutional proceedings of impeachment, for example, I don't know. I doubt it. I know lots of people who have placed bets on both sides of that question. I'm just not certain. So, as to the press, I think there are real dangers that his speech creates. First, he incites violence, and so do his followers. And yes, he can say he's joking, he's playful, but he's delegitimizing the press and encouraging others to attack it. And in my experience of reporting in lots of different places in the world, when a leader calls for that kind of an attack or uses that kind of language repeatedly to delegitimize a minority or an unpopular institution, people usually take up the call. So I'm worried that there will actually be attacks at some point in the United States on a journalist or journalists. There have certainly been some skirmishes. Secondly, he cannot rewrite the First Amendment, and he cannot undo the state laws that protect journalists. But at the Justice Department, under both the Obama administration and the Trump administration, there has been a change in attitude about leaks to the press, especially involving national security stories. The Obama administration, unfortunately, set this up during most of the administration by pressing a large number of leak cases, invoking espionage laws against journalism, and even writing some documents that appeared to make journalism a crime if you received information from a government source who had access to classified information. Now, the Obama administration turned those policies around before the end of the administration, made things right, but this administration has the attitude that journalists should not enjoy special privileges, especially around national security stories. So I think we're going to see some tough cases coming through this administration that will try to roll back the privileges that journalists have enjoyed to do this kind of reporting. The other thing that Lee writes in there that's just worth remembering about the United States and really the whole global democratic community and journalists who try to operate in a free press, these rights that we take for granted in the United States to protect confidential sources, to avoid government interference with publication, prior to publication, the world's most liberal libel standard by a good measure. All these rights are relatively young. I mean, they really date to the 1960s when the Sullivan case established this libel standard and subsequent cases refined it. Pentagon Papers, 1971. You look back at American Supreme Court jurisprudence about the press in the 1920s, it was awful. I mean, and about speech, it was awful. I mean, a socialist candidate went to jail for just giving a talk suggesting that people avoid the draft in the First World War. And there was a consensus at the highest levels of the Supreme Court that speech was dangerous and should be suppressed. Now, we have a Supreme Court today that on both left and right, I think is a First Amendment court. But this set of changes that includes delegitimizing the press and attacking the press will inevitably wash its way into state legislatures, into courtrooms, and nothing, nothing about what we have should be taken for granted because, in part, just the obvious fact it's so young in the life of the country.
Eu queria lhe perguntar a respeito do comportamento da imprensa em relação a Trump e estender essa pergunta para outros países, aqui no caso brasileiro. É claro que a gente está falando aí do presidente dos Estados Unidos, mas no caso dessas declarações muito agressivas, muito xenófobas, é o caso da imprensa dar espaço para isso ou simplesmente ignorar, fingir que não existe isso, para que essa pessoa não consiga dar eco a todas essas coisas que ela fala?
Well, he's the president of the United States, and it's still a free society, and his speech is a news story that is part of the political process. So I think covering it is inevitable and necessary. The question is, if you're running a newsroom, how do you allocate your resources? One way to answer that question would be to avoid allowing his gift for attention grabbing and for inflammatory speech that changes the subject, to avoid allowing that to drive your resource allocation of where you put your reporters and how you manage your ambitions. There's much more to the Trump administration than the president's tweets, and much more of public interest. And I think the big news organizations generally have done a good job of reporting on departures that the Trump administration represents in vetting cabinet secretaries, in ethics, in the use of public funds to fly around on private jets, in public policy, where every administration's changes of policy deserve scrutiny and investigative reporting. The most interesting thing about the Trump year-ish, not even, it only feels like 7 years, it's been, 9 months, is the way what Mr. Bannon, Trump's advisor, might call the deep state, but which longtime Washingtonians like myself just understand as the bureaucracy. We have a big federal system, right, a federal bureaucracy, and it has not had a president like this one since Nixon. On the president's first day in office, after he swore the oath of office, he became aggravated about reports about the size of his inauguration crowd. And he picked up a telephone, and he called the director of the Park Service and ordered them to remove a tweet or to change their estimate of the crowd size. I mean, that hasn't happened in Washington in at least not since the Nixon administration. And you can see the bureaucracy just recoiling from this. They're also confused. They don't have as much confidence as the press, frankly, about how to respond to this in general. But what you can see over time is they've responded by cooperating with the press. The president might call it leaks. I call it like an open system. And essentially, in the first 6 weeks, in the White House, they could not draft a new executive order without it appearing on the website of the Washington Post within 2 hours, or the New York Times, or some other news organization. And the degree of transparency that has evolved around the FBI investigation, what they've found, what sequence they're moving in, what subjects they're looking in. Why is the FBI, if it is the FBI or the Justice Department or others who are familiar with the investigation, allowing this information to come out so routinely? It's to protect the integrity of their work. They don't believe this president believes in the integrity of their investigation. And so one way to protect it is to make sure that Congress knows about it, that the public knows what's going on, what they're finding. This is the way the system is supposed to work. And that's why journalists have rallied, I think, with such confidence to the task, because they know how the system works too. And they're on the phone, and it's a great time to be a well-sourced reporter in Washington. You know, one of the great things about journalism is that you can succeed as a reporter from so many starting places. You know, that's the great thing about our diverse classrooms. We have students from 31 countries, almost half of our American students are people of color. You look around the classroom on the first day and you say, where are you from? Why did you come here? You got a prison guard who's decided he wants to starts to become a reporter about about criminal justice. And at the heart of what makes journalism successful, at the heart of what makes it credible, at the heart of its claims for these constitutional and legal rights is the reporting function. And if we're going to defend what we do and stand in front of judges and ask for privileges to protect sources, then we have to be complete, public-minded, non-trivial, professional reporters, and that's what our curriculum is essentially rooted in. Now, we also try to teach some context about what's happening in journalism so that our students are oriented, but we think these are life skills. Being a great reporter is something you do over a course of a lifetime, and we don't want to teach someone software skills that are going to be obsolete in 18 months.
Por que os jornalistas americanos erraram tanto, né? A gente aqui tinha expectativa de que a Hillary ia ganhar. Onde se errou, houve torcida demais, quer dizer, sempre há o risco quando a imprensa torce de distorcer a informação.
So there were, looking back on it, there are 5 or 6 factors. I'll just name them quickly, and you can ask about whatever seems interesting. First of all, the press was slow to recognize that Trump was a serious candidate. He wasn't taken seriously in the beginning of his campaign. He was seen as a joke. Republican Party saw him as a joke, and he built a lot of momentum on free airtime without being taken seriously for too long. Then the structural changes in American journalism, I think, played a role. We've lost hundreds and hundreds of professional reporters in the heart of the country. In the states that ultimately decided the vote, once healthy newspapers have been shrinking, they were not feeding the two coasts with the kind of syndicated heartland reporting from their own communities that might have caught the attention of the press on the two coasts. There are news deserts in the heart of the country now that didn't exist 20 years ago. Third, there was a kind of bubble of prediction science that grew up around this campaign. It grew up for good reasons. Data science is now fundamental to journalism. One aspect of data science is understanding probability and being able to make sense out of complex statistical information, including polling. In the era of big data, prediction is one of the opportunities that big data allows. But and Nate Silver, who became a franchise first at the New York Times and then at an organization at ESPN, and then the New York Times replaced him with their own version of this. They would argue that the problem is not all of the time and attention that was paid to predicting the election's outcome. The problem was journalists don't understand probability, and the public misunderstood the significance of these predictions. Okay, that's a bit of a defensive crouch, but the best version of their argument that I've heard is this. If you wake up in the morning and you turn on the weather, and it says there's a 70% chance of rain, and you take an umbrella, and you go out through the day, and it doesn't rain, and you come home, do you slam the umbrella into the closet angrily, saying, how could they have misled me so badly? No, you said that 70% means 70%. It doesn't, and weather people are not very good. Who knows if even 70% was that accurate? So statistics, probability is probability. At the Washington Post, we had election night every 4 years, and I learned through that experience of watching the best political journalists and editors handle the question of what's going to happen, not to get invested in prediction and to just be really interested in what is happening rather than what's now going to happen. There will be time. I mean, of course I was surprised, but I didn't take for granted anything about that election. It seemed so out of cycle, so out of my own experience of what a presidential campaign, is made of, and I think that was true of a lot of people, including in the Republican Party. At 10 o'clock or 10:30 or whenever Pennsylvania was called and it was clear what was going to happen, I did have one very, very strong reaction, which was to say, this may not be good for the country, but it is going to be great for journalism. and in the Post, a lot of our kind of way of answering questions about the newsroom's attitude about an election was, what's good for journalism in this election? So this is way over the top.